It's Friday, March 23rd, and this is Uptown Radio. I'm Juliette Deptiro.
And I'm Elisa Escarce. This week, Florida farm workers are in New York City. They've got a solution to sexual harassment, and they've come to spread the word.
So what we have is kind of like the cure for cancer. The cancer being sexual harassment happening everywhere.
Disability advocates are adopting a new legal strategy. They're hoping to force the MTA to build elevators in every station. Now, some riders say they can't even get to the platform.
And the subway? No, you're on your own. You're on your own.
Spring is finally coming, and so are the rats. Doctors say more rats mean more allergies, and that's bad news for New Yorkers.
The rats is out of control. At night, you couldn't come outside. The rats was running around all over.
All this and more on Uptown Radio. First, the news.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Lori London. President Trump has signed a $1.3 trillion spending measure, averting a government shutdown just hours after saying he was considering a veto. Trump has been fuming because the package does not include protections for Dreamer immigrants and doesn't provide enough money for his promised border wall.
I do want the Hispanic community to know and DACA recipients to know that Republicans are much more on your side than the Democrats who are using you for their own purposes.
But Trump is pointing to major increases in military spending included in the bill. He says he signed it as a matter of national security. The Justice Department has announced charges against 9 Iranians for alleged cyber attacks. NPR's Ryan Lucas says the suspects stand accused of hacking universities, companies, and government agencies.
The U.S. government says the 9 Iranians conducted a massive cyber campaign to break into computer systems and steal research, proprietary data, and intellectual property. The defendants allegedly made off with more than 31 terabytes of data from 144 U.S. universities, 176 foreign universities, as well as U.S. companies and government agencies. The Iranians face charges of computer fraud, conspiracy, and identity theft, among others. The indictment alleges the defendants worked for an Iranian company that acted at the behest of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. U.S. officials say the defendants are believed to be in Iran, which means they are unlikely to face trial. But officials argue that publicly identifying the alleged hackers serves as a deterrent to future cyber attacks. Ryan Lucas, NPR News, Washington.
At least 3 people are dead in southwestern France following a series of attacks by a lone gunman. Jake Saganero in Paris reports the assailant claimed to be a soldier of ISIS and had demands.
Police stormed the supermarket and shot the assailant dead in the picturesque town of Trèbes, where the gunman killed 2 people. The French Interior Minister said the gunman was a 26-year-old man of Moroccan origin, known to authorities for minor crimes and monitored for radicalization. He had demanded the release of Salah Abdeslam, the sole surviving terrorist of the November 2015 attacks. ISIS has claimed responsibility. Authorities say the gunman killed 1 person in a carjacking earlier in the morning. Shortly after, he opened fire on a group of policemen out for a jog. One of the officers was shot in the shoulder and is in stable condition. The attacker then fled to the grocery store where it all ended. Anti-terror investigators have taken charge of the case. For NPR News, I'm Jake Saganero in Paris.
Toys R Us opened its doors today with a going out of business sale, offering clearance discounts at all of its U.S. stores, including Babies R Us. And on Wall Street, trade war fears create another massive sell-off. The Dow down 425. This is NPR.
You're listening to WNYC in New York at 4:04.
For Columbia Radio News in New York, I'm Madeline Thompson. Early this morning, firefighter Michael Davidson was killed while responding to a 5-alarm fire in Harlem. It broke out on the set of an Edward Norton movie that was being filmed in a former pub. Davidson was a 15-year veteran of the fire department and became the 1,150th firefighter to die in the line of duty. The City Council has proposed its biggest budget increase in at least a decade. The council wants an extra $17 million to hire more staff members, bringing the total budget to $81 million. The money and the new employees are seen as a bid to increase the council's influence to rival Mayor Bill de Blasio. Newly elected Speaker Corey Johnson confirmed it's a move to take the council's power back. The deadline for the state budget is also approaching, but Governor Andrew Cuomo is threatening to hold it up over funding for housing repairs in New York City. The federal budget signed this morning only allocates about $200 million to the New York City Housing Authority when it needs more like $18 billion. On the Brian Lehrer Show today, Cuomo compared the state of public housing to Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria.
They're living with no heat. They're living with mold. We don't have 4 years for them to change a boiler.
The governor made a point of blaming the federal government and Mayor de Blasio for falling down on the job. Census Bureau data show that New York City broke a record in 2017. You now have 8.6 million neighbors, a 5% population increase since 2010. The Bronx emerged as the fastest-growing county in the state, but Brooklyn took in the most new residents overall. A new Broadway musical is bringing some of the cold, icy weather to the stage, not necessarily in a good way. Frozen the musical opened last night to mixed reviews, despite the smash hit movie it's based on. In a review for the New York Times, Jesse Green called it dull and dopey, though sometimes rousing. It remains to be seen whether the kids in the audience will care. Right now, it's 48 degrees and cloudy in Central Park with a chance of rain. Madeline Thompson, Columbia Radio News.
The spending bill passed by the federal government included money for transportation projects across the country. In New York, politicians have been battling over funding for the Gateway Project, a new tunnel under the Hudson River between New York and New Jersey.
The existing tunnels are about 100 years old and saw heavy flooding during Hurricane Sandy. The city says they'll need to be shut down and replaced sometime in the next 10 years. But who is going to pay for that replacement? Jeff Davis from the Inno Center for Transportation has been following the issue. I asked him if the new spending bill just signed by President Donald Trump has funding for the Hudson Tunnel and if it's enough.
The new spending bill does not have any money specifically for the Hudson River Tunnel. In 2015, the Obama administration's transportation secretary and the New York and New Jersey politicians reached a verbal agreement that the federal government would try to put forth half of the cost through grants, either through Amtrak or directly, and the other half would come from New York and New Jersey or the Port Authority collectively. But that agreement was never written down, and the Trump administration doesn't believe that that was an agreement.
I thought that some money was allocated to Amtrak, and that in that money there would be maybe some funding for the Hudson River Tunnel, potentially, but that's not, like, the name is not on the bill, but maybe some money that on the new spending bill could go to that project. Is that right?
In the new bill, Congress doubles the annual amount of funding that they give Amtrak for Northeast Corridor, Washington, D.C. to Boston, Massachusetts capital. And with that extra money, there would be conceivably, if Amtrak wanted to, and if the Trump administration gave them permission, about $388 million they could put towards the tunnel or to the Portal North Bridge in New Jersey or any of the other projects under the Gateway umbrella. But if you're just talking the tunnel, that's maybe 3% of the amount it takes to get built, and it's not really, if you start digging a hole in the ground with 3% of the money needed to get to the other side, it doesn't get you very far.
So how do we get that funded? And how the whole Gateway project plays into President Trump's infrastructure plan? I
have become convinced that it's because Senator Charles Schumer from New York is the head of Senate Democrats that I'm convinced that President Trump sees this as some kind of large bargaining chip for the future. Since it's Mr. Schumer's top priority as senator from New York, that President Trump is trying to leverage this project to get something big out of Senator Schumer and, by inference, the rest of Senate Democrats later on, possibly dealing with the infrastructure bill itself, possibly with the wall on the U.S.-Mexico border or something.
Thank you so much.
No problem.
Months after the Me Too movement began, many industries are still struggling to develop policies that address sexual harassment in the workplace.
But agricultural workers in Florida believe they found a solution. They came to New York City last week to protest in front of the Wendy's headquarters, a company that has refused to work with the group. Stevie Hertz reports.
We're in Midtown Manhattan, and Noelle D'Amico is guiding me through a protest. She wants me to meet someone.
Okay, we're going to squeeze in. Bear with me.
D'Amico helped organize the march. It's a large crowd, chanting, playing music, and carrying 11-foot-tall puppets of farm workers. They're here to support people like Gerardo Reyes Chavez.
I haven't eaten for 4 days. Today is the 5th day.
Chavez is one of over 70 protesters who are fasting. He used to work on a tomato farm and got a bus all the way from Florida to be at the protest. He's trying to draw attention to the Fair Food Program, a code that protects farm workers, with better pay, working conditions, and stopping sexual assault.
So what we have with the Fair Food Program is kind of like the cure for cancer. The cancer being sexual harassment happening everywhere, with more prevalence in the tomato fields and in agriculture in general in this country.
Chavez says the Fair Food Program is effective because of how well it's enforced. Workers don't face retribution for speaking up, and an independent organisation conducts regular checks, where at least 50% of employees at the farm are interviewed. This makes it different from other schemes, says Sean Sellers, who also campaigns for the program.
Most corporate social responsibility programs are aspirational, they're voluntary. A corporation puts out a code of conduct, but there's little in the way of actually monitoring compliance with that code of conduct, and then when suppliers are out of compliance, there's no real consequence.
But he says in this program, there are consequences. If the farms don't enforce the standards, all the big companies that are part of it, like Walmart, McDonald's, and Taco Bell, representing 60% of the market for fresh tomatoes in the States, won't buy from them.
When growers are facing the prospect of losing business, they would actually rather clean up their operations than allow a rogue supervisor to be, committing sexual harassment or sexual assault.
So the campaigners are outside the offices of the chairman of one company that hasn't joined the program and are going on a hunger strike to get their attention. They want Wendy's to join. Now, Wendy's didn't want to be interviewed, but a spokesperson said that they just don't buy tomatoes from the area where the program operates, and that Wendy's has good working conditions outside of the Fair Food Program, certified with third-party assessments. But the protesters just don't buy that. Historically, sexual assault has been widespread across the agriculture industry. Nellie Rodriguez used to pick tomatoes in Florida. Now she campaigns for the program. She's seen the problems of sexual harassment firsthand, how it starts at the top.
You're surrounded by other men who are trying to stay in the good graces of the boss by following their example in terms of vulgarities and crude jokes. You don't feel very comfortable, but you know that your ability to put food on the table for your family is tied to your ability to work.
Dr. Susan Marquis, Dean of the Rand Graduate School, says the Fair Food Program changes all that.
The workers in the Fair Food Program have eliminated sexual assault, and they have nearly eliminated sexual harassment, which is extraordinary.
And now, she says, it's growing. It's not just tomatoes in Florida anymore, but it's in farms up and down the East Coast, as far north as New Jersey. And it could go even further.
The lessons learned from this, that applies to almost any industry. It applies to a Hollywood production company. It could apply to a research institute. It certainly can apply in restaurants and the like.
So, back at the protest, Chavez is excited about spreading the program to other industries too.
We have finally arrived to the point in which we're not talking about victims. We're talking about a solution that has proven to work. And I feel that this country is awakened to this reality, which makes it the perfect moment for all of us to combine our efforts.
But right now, he's focusing on Wendy's and trying to keep his mind off his stomach. Stevie Hertz, Columbia Radio News.
Back in January, school's chancellor, Carmen Farina, launched 33 new pre-K dual language programs, classrooms where the curriculum is taught in 2 different languages.
The de Blasio administration has pushed hard for these programs in New York City, where around a quarter of 3 to 4 years old learn English as a second language. And this new approach is changing the way communities understand cultural differences. Our reporter Colin Marston has more.
It's an early Thursday morning here at the Preschool of America in Flushing, Queens, and dozens of 3- and 4-year-olds are flooding into their classrooms. But this isn't your average preschool class. Here, students are learning about wind and English, followed by rainbows and colors and Mandarin.
We have the Chinese New Year theme, so we will talk about Chinese stories.
Yumei Li is a student teacher here at the preschool, which already has a dual language program. Like a teaching aide, she bridges the gap between Mandarin and English learning. The difference here is that literacy is taught through content. Sometimes that means talking about leprechauns.
But last week we have the lucky leprechaun. We don't have the leprechaun in China, so some children could not understand the leprechaun, but we will compare. We will compare Chinese fairies and the leprechaun.
Yet, it goes so much more beyond the pot of gold and a fiery dragon. These programs are reinventing how Americans think about cultures different than theirs. Dual language programs are leading the shift from the dominant world language model, where Spanish or French is taught for 45 minutes, to an immersive one that includes learning about magnetism in Hebrew or Renaissance art in Italian. They're teaching kids a different set of skills in a globalized world.
Intercultural competence is kind of the big thing, so it's being able to navigate different cultures, being able to take perspective.
That's Kevin Wong. He studies the importance of how early childhood language skills set them up for success.
I think that is where a lot of this happens, in the school, in elementary schools, and, starting young.
But the implementation has been tricky. Dual language challenges a lot of norms about American education. There's the fact that many teachers don't speak two languages, especially when it's a language much less common than Spanish or French. And there's standardized testing, which often fails to take into account the experiences of bilingual learning. And the fact that there's no one clear idea of what dual language is. David Rogers, Executive Director for Dual Language Education of New Mexico, explains.
These programs are growing so quickly in so many different parts of the country that we just don't have time to sit together and say, okay, where do we need to reach consensus on definitions, terminology use?
In New York, there's the issue of classrooms not having an equal ratio between English language learners and their native-speaking counterparts. Andrea Sampietro, the Education Director of Preschool of America, sees this issue play out firsthand.
Because of where we're located, we usually do get a lot of Asian American children wanting to enroll in our program.
But not enough native English speakers.
We do want to kind of encourage that multiculturalism. And we will have we don't have a perfect 50-50 mix, of course, but we will have, some children from a different background.
Even with these issues, dual language is here to stay. Instead of having immigrants lose their native languages to enter American society, dual language programs argue against seeing identity as a zero-sum game. By 2044, the U.S. will be a minority-majority country, with a polyphony of different voices. In an age of bans, borders, and populist rhetoric, these children here in Flushing show a different future of cultures learning together.
The wind blew, and we saw...
For Columbia Radio News, I'm Colin Marston.
It's been 5 years since Hurricane Sandy hit New York City, and citizens of Garrettson Beach in Brooklyn suffered some of the worst damage. Today, many are still waiting for repairs.
Last night, at a town hall meeting led by New York State Senator Marty Gold, residents expressed their frustration about the long delays. Our reporter Eileen Grinch has the story.
It was a tense night inside Public School 277, a Garrettson Beach elementary school wedged between a marine park and the Plum Beach Channel. Over 100 local residents crowded into the elementary school cafeteria, looking for answers about repairs and houses not finished. Lou Mendes supervises the construction and repairs on the houses, called the Build It Back program. He sat at a table in front of the room along with State Senator Golden. Residents raised their hands, and the senator called them one at a time to present their grievances.
Who builds a house and puts a meter on the front? Con Ed. I pay Con Ed. They don't pay me.
After nearly an hour of complaints, Mendes wondered aloud whether the Build It Back program had helped anyone.
Yeah, is there any people here that are not happy? Don't we have some compliments from this?
There was sympathy from at least one resident for the officials on the stage.
And Lou, I'm starting to get worried about you because I think you're getting what's called secondhand post-traumatic stress.
The meeting finally wrapped up nearly 2 hours later, and you could hardly hear yourself over the din of commiserating residents. Nearly 50 residents are still waiting for their houses to be rebuilt. One of them, Kevin, says that at first he was told his house could be repaired. Then, 4 years later, he was told they would instead demolish his house and build him a new one.
We're friends, family, and since October of 2016, they've been paying our rent while they build our house.
If you were to take one thing away from this meeting today, what would you want to get out of this?
That people are going to do what they say.
Another local resident, Tammy, has been coming to these meetings since day one. She says every time you come, it's the same thing.
Every time you come, you say the same thing, and they say that they're going to do this, and then it takes forever. And maybe, you have 10 complaints, maybe one gets addressed. Which is why I've been to every single meeting since the start.
Tammy said, among other problems, her door won't shut and her house has heating issues.
Me, along with everybody else, they want to be heard. They don't want to be dismissed. They don't want to be told, your house is beautiful, you should be grateful, which is what I was told while I was standing there.
Senator Golden says that's why he's called this meeting. The Build It Back program was scheduled to be completed in 2016. But now, Senator Golden hopes to finish the reconstruction work by the end of this year.
There'll be a lot of egg on face here if it's not done by the 6th anniversary.
Reporting from Gerritsen Beach, Brooklyn, this is Eileen Grunch, Columbia Radio News.
New York City has the largest subway system in the country. It's also the least accessible to people with disabilities.
The Americans with Disabilities Act was passed in 1990, but few improvements have been made to the subway system since then. So, a pioneering lawsuit is trying a new approach and uniting people around the cause in the process. Madeline Thompson reports.
You have to put your hood on.
Robert Acevedo is sitting by his apartment door in his wheelchair. His husband, Michael, drapes a huge blue poncho over him. The snow is really coming down outside, and the two are preparing for a slushy journey to a doctor's appointment on the Upper East Side.
Covering your legs a little bit.
Once they've wrapped up, the Acevedos head out into the street towards Herald Square Station. Deep puddles at the curb cuts block them from getting up on the sidewalk, so Michael pushes Robert in the bike lane. They take the elevator down, hop on a train just as it's arriving, and get off at Lexington Avenue, 63rd Street. There, Michael takes a moment to appreciate the 3 shiny new elevators.
They really thought of the disabled when they were doing this stop.
This is how it's supposed to work. But Robert says traversing New York in a wheelchair is rarely this easy.
And the subway? No, you're on your own. You're on your own.
Just 108 of the 472 subway stations are accessible. The Americans with Disabilities Act was passed to help fix this, but because of how it's written, elevators are only required in new stations and some key stations, like Herald Square. Only 5 new stations have opened since 1990. Emily Seelenfreund is an attorney from Disability Rights Advocates. She says the money is there, but it's going to different priorities.
Right now the MTA is putting Wi-Fi in to a lot of stations, and that's, jumping on the rights of people who literally can't access the system.
James Wiseman, president of the United Spinal Association, agrees. He's been fighting for more inclusive transit for 40 years.
If government makes things a priority, problems get solved. Until they do, they don't.
So Seelenfreund's legal team filed a lawsuit that, instead of the Americans with Disabilities Act, uses the New York City human rights law. They claim, under the stricter local law, that the MTA is discriminating against people with disabilities by not making every single subway stop accessible.
It hasn't been used, in this context before, but, it says on its face that all, places of public accommodation need to provide equal access and equal terms and conditions to people with disabilities.
On March 5th, Seelenfreund's team and the MTA appeared in court to argue the merits of the case. Outside the courthouse that day, about 30 advocates and people with disabilities showed up to lend their support.
What do we want? When do we want it? Now! What do we want?
Robert Acevedo was there. He was holding a sign that read, "Fund Elevators Now." He told me he'd had trouble getting to the rally at all.
I couldn't come here by subway. I had to take the bus, the M55 bus here. There are many other disabled people that would have loved to come here, but they couldn't because it's not accessible.
Later that day, the protesters packed the courtroom. The judge even thanked them for appearing. Attorney Jim Wiseman says a case like this gives people with disabilities a chance to have their voices entered into the record. He also thinks, eventually, they'll prevail.
If you make the same arguments over and over again, and there's not a logical counter-argument, eventually people adopt your argument. I've lived long enough to figure that out.
The next step in the case is a negotiation meeting between the MTA and the disability advocates. It's scheduled for May 10th. Madeline Thompson, Columbia Radio News.
And now for something a little different. We're starting a new series here at Uptown Radio, stories that are a little more personal.
Our first commentary is about grad school. For some, it's more than just a place to learn and build a professional network. It can also be a place to make lifelong friends.
But how do you forge friendships across a generation gap that's 3 decades wide? Wendy Rhodes tells her story.
I remember my first grad school party. The guy who invited me said he totally related to feeling kind of lost as an older student because he himself was 28. He clearly didn't know how old I was, and I didn't say anything, but in my mind, I was thinking, my God, I have sweaters older than you. The party didn't start until 9:30, so I forced myself to stay awake long after I would have normally fallen asleep to Golden Girls reruns. But I was determined to prove to myself that at 50-something, I could still party with the best of them, and I really did want to meet new people. I arrived fashionably late, which by my standards was 9:45. I climbed about 1,000 rickety stairs to a dark living room. There was pounding house music and red and blue lights zipping around. And me, not fashionably late, but dorkily early. And it got worse. Apparently, people don't bring presents anymore. Not only had I brought one, but to make it even more full-on geek, it was in a gift bag with sparkly paper. Listen, it's hard being an older student. There's a massive cultural divide. Like the first day of class when I wrote a story referencing Archie Bunker and no one but the teacher knew who I was talking about. And it goes both ways because I'm lost when other students talk about Game of Stranger Thrones things. I'd imagine making all kinds of fascinating new friends at grad school. We'd talk all night and I'd share all this great wisdom with them. But they're not really interested in how things were. They're interested in how things are going to be. And I know now that if I want to make new friends, I have to learn how to see the world from their perspective. So while friends my age are posting pictures of their grandkids on Facebook, I'm out late, sitting on a low couch in a sketchy neighborhood, ready to pounce on anyone new that might walk in. But no one did. The few people there were just standing around, glued to their iPhones, smoking e-cigarettes. I finally took off around 11:30, just as the cool people were showing up. I went home, kicked off my sensible shoes, and started thinking about my own 20s. Whatever happened to Marlboros? Why don't people bring gifts anymore? And my God, when did the music get so awful? I'm not really sure when everything changed because I've realized that the older I get, the less I know, which is weird because at 25, I knew everything. Everything except the fact that before I could blink, I would become the older generation. Looking back, though, I'm glad I went to that party, even though the music sucked. The same way my parents thought my music sucked, and the same way the people at that party are going to think their kids' music sucks. Because that's just how it is. And while I didn't meet any new young people, I'm still hoping to. So if you ever want to teach me how things work or hear what it's like to party backstage with Pink Floyd, give me a call. Maybe we can go out for a drink or something. Sometime around, say, 6 o'clock?
This is Uptown Radio. I'm Julia Deptiro.
And I'm Elisa Escarce. Don't go anywhere. There's more to come after this break. Welcome back to Uptown Radio. I'm Elisa Escarce.
And I'm Julia Deptiro.
Coming up, one of our reporters brings us a story from Israel, where the Trump administration prepares to move the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem.
And a story about phone apps and other innovations that's making Broadway more accessible for audience members with disabilities.
These stories and more. But first, the news.
For Columbia Radio News, I'm Sarah Wyman. After a morning of flip-flopping and fickle tweeting, President Donald Trump has signed a $1.3 trillion spending bill funding the U.S. government until October. The bill, which was rushed through the House and Senate early this morning, gave generously to the military, but left out protection for DACA recipients, undocumented immigrants who were brought to the country illegally as children. President Trump blamed Democrats in a press conference this afternoon.
DACA recipients have been treated extremely badly. by the Democrats. We wanted to include DACA. We wanted to have them in this bill.
The Democrats fought back, putting the onus on the White House, which rejected their proposal earlier this week. The agreement would have established a pathway to citizenship for DACA recipients in exchange for $25 billion in funding for a border wall. John Bolton, President Trump's pick to replace Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster as National Security Advisor, is the subject of heated debate online. The Twitter controversy took off this morning over Bolton's bushy handlebar mustache, which sources close to the president say was almost a deal-breaker in his appointment. Critics also moved past Bolton's facial hair and focused on his hardline stances on foreign policy issues, which some worry could embroil the United States in conflicts abroad. Jalen Rose Wiley, the victim of Tuesday's school shooting in Maryland, has died after being removed from life support. Her death comes the day before a nationwide march in support of gun control, organized by survivors of the Parkland High School shooting in Florida. 500,000 protesters are expected to march in Washington, D.C. tomorrow. As we've heard, the Trump administration has issued sanctions and indictments against 10 Iranian hackers who are accused of stealing data and intellectual property from universities, government agencies, and the United Nations. Among the hackers is Bezrad Mesri, who, after holding new Game of Thrones episodes hostage for $6 million last November, was indicted by the American government. It's 48 degrees in Central Park, and New Yorkers are heading into a balmy spring weekend with highs of 46 degrees. The New York City March for Our Lives will disrupt traffic in Midtown Manhattan on Saturday, but public transit is expected to operate as usual. For Columbia Radio News, I'm Sarah Wyman.
Every year in New York, thousands of prisoners are released from local prisons.
And for those that are released, one of the first things on the to-do list is landing a job. That's already difficult in the city today, but getting one with a criminal record is even harder. Mira Gable reports.
After 27 years of incarceration, Craig Twiggs was out, and he knew where he was headed.
They gave me $40 in a bus ticket, and that's all I had at the time. And if it wasn't for me hearing about the Doe Fund from other prisoners talking, that's all I would have had was $40 in a bus ticket.
The they he's talking about is the Doe Fund's Ready, Willing, and Able program. It helps formerly incarcerated and homeless men find and train for jobs. And tonight is Twiggs' graduation. He's wearing a powder blue cap and gown. Buffet tables line the sides of the basement of St. Ignatius Church on the Upper East Side, ready for the ceremony to start. Twiggs got out of prison a year ago, and you might think he was worried about finding a job, but he has one. Those workers you see on city sidewalks cleaning up trash, Twiggs is their vehicle dispatcher.
I make sure those vehicles are ready for the transport clients to different projects that we have going around in Brooklyn and in Manhattan.
Mark Goldsmith helps ex-cons like Twiggs. His program, Get Out, Stay Out, teaches them how to create resumes and properly introduce themselves to potential employers. He says it can be hard to explain a criminal record.
There's no simple answer to this thing. There's a stigma. There's no question there's a stigma.
And he says there's another problem.
It's not easy. I would not characterize it easy to find work, but it's also they have to be willing to start at the bottom. They have to be willing to do entry-level positions.
Goldsmith says you might not know it, but there are a lot of programs designed to help newly released prisoners find jobs. But getting the word out can be hard.
What we could use is a Department of Reentry that coordinates all the services. There are plenty of services in New York City, plenty of them. The problem is these guys don't know how to get to them, and these women. And what they need is better direction when they come out of the prisons.
Carlos Quintana is with John Jay's Criminal Justice Prison Reentry Institute. He says outreach inside prison is difficult. It can be hard for nonprofits to coordinate efforts to reach the tens of thousands of prisoners in New York State, especially without the help from the prison system. That means for many prisoners, word of mouth from peers is really the only outreach they get about possible job opportunities.
Well, I definitely think word of mouth is very powerful, but I think it speaks to the fact that in the system, the prison and jail system, the focus is not on helping people return home.
Back at graduation, Twigs is ready to climb the stage. He's valedictorian. Ask him how he got here, his eyes begin to swell, his voice gets tight.
I never even thought the things that they think about me, but they say they see all these things in me, so I guess you would have to ask them, because me, I don't know. But I'm humbled. Looking back,
all eyes are on Twigs. The front rows are filled with other graduates. But right behind them is next year's class. 1 year to go till they get caps and gowns of their own. Mira Gable, Columbia Radio News.
Last December, President Trump announced his decision to move the Israeli embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. The new embassy will open on May 14th, which coincides with the 70th anniversary of Israel's founding.
It's a move that was greeted with enthusiasm by the Israeli government and outrage from Palestinians. And that's caused a rift among Jewish activists here in New York. Augusta Anthony traveled to Jerusalem and brought back this report. She begins at the most recent scene of Palestinian anger.
We have confirmed that there was a terrorist attack this afternoon in Jerusalem in the Old City. The attacker was shot and killed at the scene.
That's Mickey Rosenfeld, spokesperson for the Israeli police, confirming a Palestinian attack on an Israeli officer last Sunday. It's one of several that has taken place in recent weeks to express Palestinian dismay at the embassy move. Why are they angry? Because both sides claim Jerusalem as their capital, and for decades its status has been part of a larger peace process. Now, President Trump says he's taking the issue off the table, and that hasn't been sitting well with the Palestinian side. Middle East expert Nizar Farsak explains.
This is the greatest, most explicit manifestation of the U.S. Bias towards Israel. It completely undermines the peace camp in Palestine, but also puts the United States in hostility with the Palestinians.
Farsak says these hostile demonstrations in the Old City are isolated, not likely to cause a united uprising. And he may be right. Palestinians have been under Israeli occupation since the 1967 war, and many are resigned to the state of things. But Trump's decision has changed the status quo. And in the Old City, just streets away from Sunday's attack, Palestinian shopkeeper 24-year-old Badway Omar has an appetite for change.
I want a big change to have a fair government for everyone. We can live in peace.
So you think that the US should recognize the capital of Israel is Jerusalem?
No, I don't think so. My opinion, I think it should be for Palestine or international city for everyone.
Jerusalem as an international city has often been suggested in the framework of a two-state solution. But those in the pro-Israel camp want it as a Jewish city. However, not all American Jews are sure. At the Western Wall, I met student Ian Rogers, who is visiting on Birthright, a program allowing Jews to visit their spiritual homeland.
I think the consequences weren't really weighed properly, and I think it's going to add a lot of complications to the peace process between the Arabs and the Israelis.
His views are shared with progressive Jews back here in New York. Ilana Kravitz is the Education and Programming Chair of J Street U at Columbia University. It's a liberal Jewish advocacy group and opposed to the decision.
The context in which it was done and also the lack of recognition of Palestinian ties to East Jerusalem are the problematic parts of this decision.
Kravitz says the move undermines hopes of a fair deal for both sides.
I feel like the Jerusalem decision and the backlash towards it is from a feeling of wanting better things for Israel, but I think a lot of it is also wanting a better future for Palestinians.
While liberal Jews advocate for a more measured approach, conservative Jews are broadly supportive of the move. Sharon Beck runs Zionists for Trump and is relieved a president has finally taken action. She says Trump is protecting the Jewish state of Israel, that he's recognizing their claims to their holiest sites,
And for her, its importance can't be underestimated.
In a world where there were no anti-Semitism, it still would be important, but because there is anti-Semitism, it's essential.
Although a welcome move to some Jewish activists here in the US, Palestinians say the opening of the US Embassy in Jerusalem in May puts the brakes on President Trump's long-awaited peace plan. The Jerusalem decision could have far-reaching consequences if the Arab world refuses to come to the table. Augusta Anthony, Columbia Radio News.
At least 30,000 people are expected to converge in New York tomorrow for the March for Our Lives. It's one of dozens of marches being organized across the country. They're calling for gun reform after the high school shooting in Parkland, Florida last month.
This morning, I spoke with Julia Garamani, one of the organizers of the march. She's a first-year law student at Columbia. I asked her what her days are looking like leading up to the march.
So I have 4 to 6 hours of class, and then I'm doing about 6 to 8 hours of work on this daily for the last 2 or 3 weeks. And my teachers have been incredibly supportive and are going easy on me for not being the greatest student the last few weeks. I'm going to have to catch up. I know that so many people have been putting in time. Nobody's getting paid. We have them helping plan the event. You know, we have a lot of logistical things like permits, insurance, the route, security, getting elected officials there.
And so what is it for you personally? What is it that motivates you? Why are you devoting so much of your time to this?
I think that this moment is a crystallization of a long buildup of energy around this issue. I'm hoping to bring my knowledge and passion about intersectionality and about the way that New York especially has been impacted by this issue, and to kind of localize and ground the movement here in that way.
Yeah, I know a lot of the focus, for obvious reasons, around the March for Our Lives has been on Parkland and on Florida, but what do you see as the important New York City-specific issues?
We are the safest major city in the world, but gun violence still exists here. Just the other day, a man in Brooklyn killed his entire family and himself. These kinds of things happen fairly regularly. In New York State especially, we have a huge issue because while our gun laws are relatively stringent, about 70% of gun deaths in New York are by the hands of guns that come from out of state. That's why I think the push for federal legislation is incredibly important. The interstate trafficking of guns is an enormous problem. So I think New York, while situated maybe better off than in other states like Florida, there are still issues here, and it still does affect people's lives.
I know that New York is generally seen as a fairly, liberal city, but has there been pushback against some of this?
The city itself has been incredibly supportive. The NYPD has also been incredibly supportive. I think most of the pushback on this march, besides from people who oppose the legislation suggestions generally, is about diversity and inclusion, and I'd love to address that. I know that there is a lot of frustration from communities of color who feel that white voices, white faces are being centered in this conversation. I think that there are a lot of dimensions to that that we've been trying to deal with. First of all, we hear those concerns and we recognize them, and I share them. And that's why we really are hoping to bring people to the table to inform us, to educate us, and to speak to that. I know that we're expecting the New York City head of Black Lives Matter to be attending tomorrow and giving a short introduction to a 17-year-old girl representing the group who will be speaking.
So what do you think tomorrow is going to look like? Like, what time have you set your alarm to get up in the morning?
So the general public is coming at 10 a.m. I should be there around 6 a.m. It's going to be really, really exciting. I'm feeling a little nervous, but also energized.
All right, Julia. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate you coming in today.
Thank you.
The only thing you need to enjoy your Broadway show is a ticket and maybe a night off.
But for some, it's not that easy. Theatergoers with disabilities need accommodations to help them enjoy live theater on their own terms. Now, producers are implementing new ways to make Broadway more accessible for everyone. Juan Torres Falcón has this story.
Katie Sweeney loves musicals so much that she has seen over 150 shows on Broadway. Naturally, she wanted to share that love with her son, Dusty. But Dusty is one of the 3.5 million Americans on the autism spectrum. Sometimes Dusty talks to himself. It's soothing to him. When Dusty was 8 at his second Broadway show, the cast and crew complained that Dusty's self-talk was too loud.
I dragged Dusty out of that theater, 80 pounds of him, and he was screaming, "Stay, stay, stay." I will tell you, that was, to date, profoundly the most isolating moment of this autism journey that we're on.
Dusty's story is common among those on the autism spectrum, but Broadway producers are responding. The Broadway League, a coalition of theater owners and producers, along with the Theater Development Fund, are creating autism-friendly performances by removing sensory elements like jarring lighting, lowering music, and adding trained volunteers to help.
I was able to reintroduce Dusty to Broadway, and through many autism-friendly performances, he's learned to be a quiet and respectful member of a theater audience, and so it really is a lovely tale that has a marvelous arc to it.
Holly Cohen is the former president of the New York City chapter of the Hearing Loss Association of America. She loves theater too.
You know, you can imagine if you love theater, and then if you're sitting in the audience, and then you can't hear everything on the stage to be able to follow the show, it is just so ultimately frustrating.
Producers are trying to end that frustration with Gala Pro, a new app that uses personal smartphones to help patrons who are deaf or experience hearing or vision loss. Kyle Wright is the director of digital projects at the Schubert organization. For Kyle, making sure that the lyrics and dialogue in the app are perfectly in sync with the action on stage is key.
You don't want to be the person that's ruining a joke for everybody because you're laughing before they are, because you're reading it, not hearing it.
Dusty is 20 now. He and his mom have been to 15 autism-friendly performances together, and thanks to those experiences, he can now attend standard performances too. His mother recently took him to a performance of Wicked. Toward the end of the second act, Elphaba and Glinda, the Witches of Oz, sing a ballad together about friendship.
He was clutching my hand during For Good, and when they sang Because I Knew You, I Have Been Changed for Good, he picked up my hand and he kissed it. And that had never happened before.
The Broadway League and Theater Development Fund have partnered up to create theateraccess.nyc. That's their new website where you can find information about all of these accommodations and the schedule for autism-friendly performances, open captioning, and other accessibility options. For Columbia Radio News, I'm Juan Torres Falcón.
Spring is just around the corner here in New York City. Barren trees are starting to show signs of leaves, flowers peek out from planters, and rats are emerging from their winter burrows and hitting the streets.
With those rats comes a host of health issues. And this allergy season, doctors are worried about their impact on respiratory health. Sarah Wyman has more.
New Yorkers are used to seeing rats on the subway, scurrying between discarded soda cans and piles of trash on the platform and expertly avoiding the third rail. But according to Matt Perzanowski, who studies allergies and asthma in Columbia University's Department of Environmental Health Sciences, we share more than our subway stops with the city's rats. Even when we can't see them, they're making our allergies worse.
It's pretty clear if you're seeing rats in the subways, the allergens from those animals are going to get into the air.
Here's how it works. Rats, mice, and cockroaches release tiny particles called allergens in their urine and in their fur. Every time a train car comes shooting out of the subway tunnel, it disrupts the air at the bottom of the tracks and stirs those allergens up into the air.
You're going to pick it up on your clothes, you're going to leave it on the subway seat, the next person will take it home, or it'll be in the air. So exposure to allergens in the public is quite common.
Those allergens lock into our respiratory tracts and trigger swelling, congestion, and, for some, asthma attacks. And the subway isn't the only place New Yorkers are breathing in rat urine. According to Perzanowski, allergen levels are high anywhere rats are living, which in New York City is basically everywhere.
A lot of garbage on the corners. There was garbage in the middle of the block, and they had rats climbing on side of the walls.
Charles Calloway and I are standing on a street corner in West Harlem. Behind us, there's a giant green metal fortress of a trash can. It's the kind rats can't get into, and it's a point of pride for the neighborhood. Because when Calloway, who's a community organizer with We Act for Environmental Justice, got a call about this neighborhood about 5 years ago, it was overrun with rats.
The rats is out of control. At night, you couldn't come outside. The rats was running around all over.
That's Valerie Settles, or Big Val, the self-proclaimed mayor of 145th Street. As she's telling me about the rats, she pulls over Selena Fields to make her point. Fields lives in the neighborhood too, and a couple years ago, she says her infestation was so bad, the rats were keeping her up at night.
We had rats in the building so bad that you would hear them like this over my headboard. And I mean squeaking so bad, real in the baseboards, okay, that I ran out of my house.
Aging infrastructure, lax garbage collection, and negligent sanitation management all contribute to rat infestations. And low-income communities are especially vulnerable to those conditions. Matt Perzanowski says it's no coincidence Upper Manhattan communities like this one have some of the highest asthma rates in the country.
When you think about the reasons for why it's become so common in low-income communities, the environment is clearly part of the story.
The New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene says it's aware of this problem, and it's trying to combat it. In the last year alone, the city has passed a bill enforcing healthy air quality standards in homes and allocated $32 million in funding to remove garbage from streets where vermin are a problem. But health experts say climate change poses a new challenge to controlling the city's rat population. As winters grow warmer, more rats and their young will survive the cold season. And in springtime, they'll make it harder for New Yorkers to breathe. Sarah Wyman, Columbia Radio News.
Gray hair is usually seen as a sign of aging, though there's a new trend with kids these days, one that embraces silvery follicles. But many women still aren't sold.
My co-host, Alisa Escarce, brings us this commentary about her own dilemma with gray hair.
A couple months after I turned 28, I quit my job and headed to a hair salon. I've always thought of my hair as a kind of personal billboard. And on that day, I wanted it to say, "Hey world, the lady with this hair is scared of nothing." I decided to start a new career as a journalist, but I didn't have a plan. I asked the hairdresser to give me one of those dye jobs where it looks like the bottom half of your hair got dunked in peroxide. A couple hours later, I looked like a Dallas housewife. I hated it. I swore I'd never dye my dark brown hair again. That didn't last long. I color my hair almost every month now. That's because as the blonde hair grew out, it was replaced by a mix of brown and gray. A lot of gray. It seemed like it was everywhere. You know what gray hair means. It means old. And old was not what I wanted to be at that moment. I was about to be an intern at a radio station. Now I'm a student. Sometimes it feels like I pressed rewind on my 20s. So now, every month, I get a box of dye in the mail. There's a little tube of cream that I squeeze into a bottle with another cream. I comb it into my roots with a fork and then rinse it in the shower. I never expected I would do this. My mom has always dyed her hair, and I remember watching as a kid while she sat in our hairdresser's kitchen with strips of foil on her head. I thought, what a hassle. I wanted to be one of those women who's proud to be older and wiser. Like my friend Moravia. We both turned 30 a couple weeks ago, and she loves her gray hair.
I guess I was thinking about becoming older and the benchmark of turning 30 as like, finally, I'll get some legitimacy that I've really fought for. So gray hair for me has been a marker of that in a positive way.
Last time I saw my mom, she told me she was thinking about going gray. Recently, she let her roots grow out more than usual.
So I had like a whole inch of gray, and I thought, well, it actually looks pretty nice. It's like a silvery, shiny silvery. But then I decided, I'm just going to still be brown.
Why do you decide that?
Why? Because I wanted to stay young. I wanted to be young. I wasn't ready. Because people don't think that I'm my age.
She says people think she's 50 or so. She's actually 64. So do you think at this point, you'll probably keep coloring it forever?
At least for the next 10 years. Maybe longer.
I probably also just want to stay young. But since my birthday, I've been thinking about letting my grays grow out. I stopped ordering the hair dye, though I have a few extra boxes. So I guess I'll use those up and decide after that. For Columbia Radio News, I'm Elisa Escarce. Well, that's it for our show today. We hope you enjoyed this edition of Uptown Radio.
Our executive producer today was Cassiana McClanahan, and Dan Rabb led our team of reporters with help from producer Wendy Rhodes.
Colin Marston directed the studio team with the help from producers Juan Torres Falcon and Stevie Hertz.
This stream made it live to the web thanks to Augusta Anthony, and Bo Hamby wrote today's copy.
And a tip of the hat to the radio pros behind the scenes. That's Sally Herships, Deb Amos, Gilda DiCarli, and Ben Shapiro, with support from Carrie Donahue. I'm Elisa Escarce.
And I'm Julia Jepiro. Uptown Radio will be back next Friday, live at 4 p.m. Until then, you can find us at uptownradio.org. Thanks for listening.